So we all know that Necron technology is some of the most powerful in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. They have the ability to move the very stars themselves, to harness the limitless power of the Catan, and to defy the very laws of physics. But did you know that with the use of one small stratagem, they can also break the fourth dimension and stop time itself? What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we are back for some ridiculous rules. This is a video series where we take some of the weirdest and craziest interactions in Warhammer 40,000 and break them down and exactly how they work, and probably some good ways to fix them. Before we get started into the video, just a quick reminder to drop a like on the video if you enjoyed this style of content, and to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. That really helps these sort of weird, kind of off-the-wall style videos. This ridiculous rules one is one that I'm still kind of feeling out, seeing if people like, and if I'm going to continue the series. So if you enjoy it, let me know down below. But anyway, let's get right into this ridiculous stratagem and talk about how Necrons can break the laws of time. We're talking about the most powerful Necron stratagem ever. One that literally stops time in the middle of any game of Warhammer 40k. Time doesn't progress forwards or backwards. All of your units are frozen in place, waiting for an eternity for the temporal bubble surrounding the table to expire. And the stratagem that causes all of this ruckus that we're talking about today is none other than the unassuming Dimensional Corridor. Dimensional Corridor is a movement phase stratagem that lets you pick up a Necron warrior unit or a core infantry unit and teleport it directly to the location of a monolith elsewhere on the table. It's pretty cool, right? Pretty straightforward. It lets you redeploy your units, maybe pull them out of a sticky situation if you need to, put them back to where your monolith is, and then they're free to go. Seems pretty straightforward. So how exactly does it work? The strat at the start of your movement phase picks up a core infantry unit, and then at the end of that phase, in the reinforcement step, if you have a monolith on the table, it puts them down wholly within 3 inches of it and 9 inches away from enemies. The redeployment to the monolith is mandatory, so you can't, for example, use it to pick up a unit and then hold it in reserve. I said that they redeploy if you have a monolith, so, what happens if you didn't bring one? The way that this dimensional corridor breaks not only the first through third dimensions of time and space, but also the fourth one as well, is that when the stratagem is used, it only requires you to target the infantry unit being teleported at the start of the movement phase. When you choose to use the stratagem, it doesn't necessarily need to have a legal landing zone open in that movement phase for when, at the end of the movement phase, they teleport back onto the table. So why exactly is this an issue? Well, most reserve abilities in the game similar to Dimensional Corridor are optional. The difference being that Dimensional Corridor is not. The redeployment of that unit is mandatory, and you have to do it at that reinforcement step. No other reinforcement step during the game, only the one in the same movement phase that you use the stratagem. The weird thing about Dimensional Corridor is that not only does it specify when the unit has to deep strike back onto the table, but also restricts where they are to be placed. Now, normally, reserve abilities get around issues like this by making the reserve placement ability optional. For example, the strategic reserves rules say that you can set up a unit in the reinforcement step of your movement phase, meaning that if for some reason they have nowhere to be placed, your enemies screened out the entirety of the table, all of the table legends are being lined with Kroot, they must then be held in reserve, and if you're playing a GT or match play style, they risk dying to the reserve restrictions, where if they aren't placed on the table by the third battle round, they're destroyed, and if they're not on the table by the end of the game, they're also destroyed. However, Dimensional Corridor doesn't do this, because the placement is mandatory, not optional. Which means that if they have nowhere to be placed, what happens? Now, I can hear you typing already.
But Trevi, doesn't that mean that the unit is destroyed because the models can't be legally placed in coherency in the position that you would place them on the table?
In hindsight, this actually might have been a good topic for my most misplayed rules in 9th edition video, which I just released this week. Check it out. It's a pretty good one. But that's not actually how reserves work anymore. That's an 8th edition rule you're thinking of. In 9th edition, if a unit can't legally be placed thanks to its reserve ability, it simply doesn't get placed. So if you can't fit all of the models in the unit where you want to place them, that's simply not a legal landing zone for them. Since most of the reserve abilities in the game are optional, like we said before, if they've screened out where your reinforcements can come in and there's no legal place for those units to stand, they often will just have to wait till next turn, and again, they risk running into the 3rd battle round and 5th battle round walls that will kill those units if they haven't jumped on the table. However, this is not the case for Dimensional Corridor, which requires that the unit be placed in the same phase that it is used. No other phase in the game can it be placed. So with that in mind, what happens when you choose a warrior unit or another Necron core infantry unit to use Dimensional Corridor on, but there's no monolith on the table? You pick them up off the table and then proceed with your movement phase. Once you get to the reinforcement step of that phase, nothing happens. Like literally nothing. The game doesn't progress. Time itself just stops. Because you're required to resolve the second half of the stratagem at that time before moving on from your movement phase, but you can't, since you can't legally place the unit, the reinforcement step can't legally end. Congratulations, you've just blue screened Warhammer 40k. And thus, Necrons demonstrate their ultimate control of the 4th dimension. Even time flows like a liquid in their hands. Just a really viscous liquid that they can't move through, I guess. As a side note, it's also worth mentioning that this can happen even if you do have a monolith, but the legal landing zones around the monolith are blocked. So there are situations where you can use it and declare a monolith to teleport to, but this still happens. So what exactly are the implications of this weird interaction? Honestly, there's not much. If you're playing an untimed format like a casual game, or more realistically, like a tournament game that has timed matches, the game is technically just over right then, since you'd run out of time before finishing that movement phase. This means that in a situation like that, if you're playing a tournament game that has a timed match, you can technically force a win if you're playing Necrons and currently up on the scoreboard, then trigger this stratagem to essentially end the game prematurely. You would just wait in your movement phase until the timer run out, then score out the game state as it stands. You'd probably win if you have a VP lead at that point. That said, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a TO that doesn't instead just hand you a game loss for instituting a game state lock like this. And if you're doing it in a casual game, dude, what's wrong with you? What are you doing? If you're playing a format using chess clocks, like most competitive formats should be at this point, there's no reason to try to abuse this interaction. Since once you use it, you're locked in your own movement phase, and your clock eventually just runs out without you performing any additional game actions. And since most chess clock rule sets don't require that you perform mandatory game actions once you're clocked out, the unit being placed just dies, and you lose the game, probably, as your opponent runs up VPs against you without being able to do anything to stop them. So outside, like, some super corner case situations that will probably be taken care of by TOs out in the field, this isn't really an abusable interaction, which is good. That said, it is hilarious and a true demonstration of Necron's ultimate control of the cosmos. Even it's to their own detriment. And so they could just show off their ultimate power even though they lose the game. That does sound like a Necron thing, though. I can imagine some overlord twirling his metallic mustache.
Watch this, if I can't win, you can't either. No one wins this game of 40k. We just lock everyone in a time dilation field and wait until the universe ends around us.
This interaction is really easily fixed. There's a couple ways you can do it. First off, you can require that a monolith be targeted when you use the stratagem. So you go use the stratagem at the start of your movement phase, select one Necron core infantry unit and one monolith. Then at the reinforcement step, you place the Necron core infantry unit next to the monolith. Boom, done. You could also specify that if the unit cannot be placed in the reinforcement step legally, it is destroyed. That actually still makes the stratagem pretty useful. It's like a super desperate breakout. If you can't physically desperate break out a unit, they're wrapped, you don't want to spend a CP on it, maybe they're physically stopped from being able to leave, you can just pop this 1 CP stratagem, have no monoliths on the table, and just kill the Necron warrior unit. That's pretty cool. I don't know if that's going to be super useful, but that's some tech to keep in your back pocket if it does end up getting ruled that way. Or in addition, you can just make the placement optional. Maybe they can drop in on a monolith later on in the game. That probably is the most powerful way that they could errata this ability. And I think the other ones are a little bit more realistic because it would allow you to pick up Necron units and keep them in reserve reserve until the end of the game. And given how the reserve rolls work, if you start on the table and then are picked up later, you actually are not destroyed at the end. So your opponent cannot kill that unit, like if it's a while we stand target or something like that. Probably not going to be rolled that way. And I think most TOs will just tell you that either the unit is dead or the stratagem cannot be used if you can't target both the core infantry unit and the monolith, which I think is totally fair and makes a ton of sense. I hope this gets picked up in an FAQ the next time that GW goes over Necrons, but I honestly don't think it's a super big deal. It's not really breaking any in-person gameplay. But anyway, that's all we have to say about Dimensional Corridor and this wacky situation that can blue screen a game of Warhammer 40k. I'm a weirdo because I think I love interactions like these. I like it when people can figure out funky game states that just cause a game to lock up. That's super funny. I've heard it described before that board games and tabletop games are programs that you run on humans, which I think is very appropriate. And this is a situation where there's a bug in the program and sometimes it just shuts down. Fortunately, as humans, we are thinking machines, so we can figure out some ways to get around this by altering the program itself, which is, I think, what we're going to have to do in this situation. Anyway, enough of this highfalutin cosmic ideals. Let's talk about some patrons. They're pretty cool people. You can see them up on the screen here. Also, YouTube channel members. They help support the channel and make content like this possible. So I really appreciate them. You can join them at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, and they get some sweet benefits as well. They get early access to videos. They get patrons-only videos, which I'm going to be doing a little bit more commonly in the near future, and they get early access to T5S2 pods, which is are in high demand right now. Our wait lists are getting pretty long, so if you want to jump into a pod as soon as possible, jump on that Patreon. Anyway, thanks again for watching. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. I really appreciate it. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.